Welcome to another dimension, a dimension of understanding. You are entering a place where reality collides with truth. There are no limits, there are no boundaries. This is Offplanet Radio.
Well, welcome once again to Offplanet Radio Live. Boy, that cue faded fast, didn't it? Sorry about that. Just when you think you have everything down, there's always one more detail in the pipeline. I'm Randy Moggins. This is Offplanet Radio, and you can find us at offplanetradio.com. And I do have my guest on the line, and I'll bring him up in a minute. Couple of details we got to talk about. First off, chat room at offplanetradio.net. I will monitor that for questions, and the way you're going to do that is questions, comments for the guest about the show will be in all capital letters, uppercase. And that way I can see them real quick, and I don't have to troll the chat board myself tonight. Sorry, bad term there. And so that's what's going on with the chat room. There's a phone number posted there. And Dave's given me a couple of numbers now for listen live and phone in on the Wolf Spirit line as well. And for anybody who doesn't have the numbers, we'll give those out when we take callers. On the website right now, I want to call your attention to a couple of details. First off, we do have a brand new series with White Wolf on Atzikin, continuing the work in trauma-based mind control and healing from any type of trauma, any type of personal experiences that you've gone through. You want to listen to the healing path on the front page of offplanetradio.com right now. And also an interview I did last weekend with Fernando Vasa, Engines of Mass Creation, the Coming Global Awakening. This is an interesting take on energy because he's not talking about black box technology. He's talking about the internal power that we human beings possess in terms of energy. He comes at it from a completely unique standpoint. So you want to hear that interview. You want to also take a look at the information on the Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference that's going to be occurring in Hilversum, Holland, November 9th, 10th, and 11th. I wish I was going to be there. Good news today, released from the UK. Gary McKinnon will not be extradited to the U.S. Gary McKinnon, of course, cracked into some NASA computers and uncovered what he believed was evidence of secret space operations and extraterrestrial activity. And it's been a very long process for Gary since 2009. He's been fighting extradition. So the word from the Home Office is that hacker Gary McKinnon will not be extradited. And the way they did this, basically they discredited him. And that's the way things work in this particular realm, is that once you discredit yourself, you're no longer a danger. Isn't that kind of sad? So we're going to talk about a subject tonight that's going to go kind of a little bit on the dark side because it does talk about events that are coming. And as I talked about last week, you have to balance the information that you take in on the internet because there's a lot of it. And you have to know who you are and what you're supposed to do and where you're supposed to be. Everybody has a higher self, an inner leaning, a knowing, a God, whatever you want to call it, and you have to deal with information on that level. Don't be distracted. The first work goes on inside of you. And so I think that covers all of that. Let's bring my guest on. He is one of the foremost figures in the world of remote viewing. He is a professor at Emory University, and he is the founder of the Farsight Institute. I want to welcome to the show Courtney Brown. Courtney, welcome.
Randy, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really my honor and pleasure.
Well, it's good to get you on. I've wanted to do this for a couple of months, and it finally lined up because we took a lot of interest in what you've been releasing at the Farsight Institute. Maybe what we do first off is what I like to do is I don't assume we need a whole lot of background because you're out there a lot and people kind of do know who you are. But maybe introduce yourself a little bit and give us a little bit of background on remote viewing and your involvement with it.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I am a professor at a major university, but I do not do any remote viewing research at the university.
Right.
I do my remote viewing research at the Farsight Institute, which is separate. That's important because I'm the leading, I can say that absolutely unambiguously, scholar, academic, who studies the subject of remote viewing as it was developed by using procedures that were developed by the United States military and used for espionage purposes, or procedures that are derivative of those structured data methodologies. And the reason I can say that is because I'm the only academic. That's why it's important for people to know that I'm the only academic. That's sort of a joke on myself because I'm the leading, but because it's the only. Because the academy, colleges and universities worldwide have not embraced the subject. We're at that waiting to exhale moment where people are sort of holding things back. And 15 years ago, many people said I was just deluded. And no one's saying that now. There's no one is laughing anymore. You never bet against a smart guy with a really big publication record who never backs down. You just don't. So I'm a mathematician, but I'm an applied mathematician working in a social science program, but we don't use this stuff there. What I do there is in the university is statistics, nonlinear differential equations, things like that in a social science venue. So the basic idea here is that the work that we do at the Farsight Institute is not rivaled any place. We're a non-profit, and the work that we do are science investigations into using remote viewing into the nature of time, the nature of physical reality, and into mysteries, such as mysteries of anomalies on Mars, mysteries of past civilizations on Earth, but even more interestingly, the existence of multiple realities. I often like to say something like, Randy, what color shirt are you wearing right now, if you don't mind me asking?
It's actually maroon.
Okay, well, there's another version of us that's just as equally real as what we are, where you're wearing either a white t-shirt, or you're wearing a suit, or you're interviewing somebody else. And those realities literally coexist with us, an infinite number of them. And that seems so unintuitive and so impossible from a classical physics perspective. But we investigate things like that and indeed find very positive support for that being real. And we also investigate things like an exploding planet that used to exist between Mars and Jupiter.
Yes.
That used to be an idea that was raised a long time ago by an astronomer named Olbers, and more recently has been raised, and a huge amount of planetary data has been drawn to support that idea by Thomas Van Flandern, the just recently late astronomer who was the head of his Department of Celestial Mechanics at the Naval Observatory, very mainstream. And so while the ideas that we investigate are often scoffed at by mainstream physicists, mainstream astronomers, mainstream scientists, the results are unambiguous. And nobody laughs anymore. Nobody laughs anymore. And that's really such a delicious point that we're at right now. And so when I've talked about the results that you wanted me to talk about a little bit today, which is the post-2012 Earth Changes project, which is another project entirely, that was a completely unexpected thing. That, believe it or not, started out having nothing to do with the Mayan calendar, having nothing to do with 2012, having nothing to do with anything like disasters or anything. It was actually a rather mundane experiment that utilized a very large number of remote viewers. And the basic idea for it was an attempt to see if remote viewing could be used to discern subtle climate change over, say, a 5-year span. So what we did was we looked at climate change in ecologically fragile environments around the world between the time June 1st, 2008 and June 1st, 2013. And the idea was to see if remote viewing could be used to see if there was maybe a little bit more storms, perhaps a little bit rise in the sea level, perhaps a little bit more ultraviolet radiation because of the ozone hole, whatever. We just didn't know. We were expecting, and it was a test to see if remote viewing could discern subtle things like that. The only problem with the study is it was amazingly well designed, I'm pleased to say, because the results we came in were not subtle at all. They were humongous. They were right off the scale. And the person who was the most shocked was myself, because I wasn't expecting this stuff. And when I explained a little later on how we got the results and why the results are so surprising to us and the magnitude of the results, you really get a real sense that this is really an extraordinary and unparalleled body of data. I want to say that no matter how much we talk about it here, the bulk of what we do at the Farsight Institute, our website is www.farsight.org. That's Farsight, like seeing far, farsight.org, because we're a nonprofit. When people come to our website, that's been recently redesigned and is really nice in terms of navigation. Mm-hmm. They nonetheless are quite challenged by looking at how much we have available for people. And for years they've been saying, I need to find some way to sort of, where do I start? So finally this year we decided to put out a DVD that sort of would allow people to hit the ground running. And so what we did was we put out a DVD called The Farsight Experiment, which summarizes our major results up through 2011. And the Farsight Experiments is really the place people should go. And it also includes the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, about the post-2012 Earth changes. And it's important because in the DVD, I tie everything together, all the other projects that we do. So we tie the multiple universe phenomenon together with that. We put the stuff with regard to major sudden change, or what's called catastrophism, as compared with, say, uniformitarianism. I explain all that and put it all together to show that what we're heading towards, if these data are correct, in the post-2012 world is not a completely foreign idea. That these things have happened in the past, and you have to understand the nature of change, how it starts with certain processes, certain types of events called bifurcation events, and old processes get destroyed at that point when new processes start up. And that's the nature of living. That's the nature of existence. And unless you see it all tied together, the post-2012 Earth changes just by itself can be confusing. So I really recommend people to start with the DVD to understand how we do this stuff. And I guess the last thing I want to mention is that what remote viewing actually is, for anybody in your audience that might be new to it, is it's a mental procedure. And it uses the normal waking state of consciousness, but using methodologies that are highly structured, meaning you do a lot of things and you do one thing after the next, to perceive things across time and space in complete violation of the classical and relativistic laws of physics. So I have actually given talks at major universities all over the world. And in particular, while remote viewing is not taught at the university level, I get invited by university. I get invited to speak at universities, and that's different from, let's say, giving a course. Remember, the first major course on gravity was in like the 1930s.
Right.
I think it was in Princeton, and the professor had to apply to be able to teach that course. And that was gravity. So with remote viewing, it's somewhat similar. No one's laughing anymore, and I am speaking at university venues, but it's
Are you speaking on remote viewing when you go to these universities?
Oh, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, I've spoken at the University of Virginia. I just came back from the University of Boulder, University of Colorado at Boulder, and in Boulder this summer, I gave a talk for the Society for Scientific Exploration about the physics of remote viewing, how it does actually work. And despite the laws of classical and relativistic physics, I've spoken to a group of physicists Nobels in Lucerne as a keynote speaker. I mean, they're interested. Many are very interested because they don't really understand quantum mechanics by their own admission. They know how to calculate with quantum mechanics. I mean, they can do the calculations well. They understand the math. And being a mathematician myself, even though I work within a social science program, but I nonetheless am a mathematician, so I can speak the same language that they speak. So, they often ask me, wondering if I'm going to give them any insight into understanding quantum mechanics. And I do have insight into that, and I do think we're actually headed towards a major revolution in science within a very short period of time. I'm also very interested in an observation that we just made recently, that we've been doing major projects in a multi-methodology way for about 6 years now, working with people like Lyn Wheaton, who runs the Hawaii Remote Viewrs Guild. Glenn was out of Special Forces Intelligence. And also Lyn Buchanan, who came out of Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. And he's trained a large number of people with controlled remote viewing. And I worked with them and the viewers for like 6 years. And we were just reviewing recently, and it was interesting to note that we haven't been like totally wrong on anything over the last 6 years. Like nothing. The farthest thing that was possibly interpreted as a wrong result was an earthquake prediction that was a surprise to us because we weren't looking for any earthquakes in Los Angeles.
The LAX prediction.
LAX, yeah. And that happened. That was 6 months before. Before it was predicted that it was. We looked at the target data for LAX December 1st, 2008.
What were you looking for in that particular sighting?
We were actually involved in this climate study. That turned out to be the post-2012 Earth changes. And I was getting so many dramatic results, I said, maybe something's wrong. So let's just do a near 6 month target that we know about. Let's try LAX 6 months from now. It was sort of like saying we were getting... Imagine yourself a scientist in a laboratory and your meters are telling you weird things.
Right.
And the first thing you want to do is check the meters. So that's what we were. We were doing this post-2012 Earth changes, and the results were coming back wacky, like big things. And so I said, well, okay, let's really quickly do a calibration target 6 months into the future, December 1st, 2008, LAX, and see if we get an airport. And we got what looked like a devastated, huge earthquake had hit the Los Angeles region, destroying LAX. And looking at the way the situation was on the ground based on those data, with the repair crews and everything, it looked like that big earthquake happened some months before. So based on analysis, which was new to me because I didn't do earthquake analysis, I said, this really looks like it happened at the end of July. So like July 29th or 30th of July. So I wrote up a probability graph saying, based on these data, I'm expecting the most probable time for this earthquake to be late July, last few days in July. And we'll just wait and see what happens. And sure enough, this was, like a month or so before, 2 months before, late July. And sure enough, on July 29th, 2008, there was a 5.8 magnitude earthquake, which was one of the most significant in the LA area in a long time. Now, it completely shut down the cell phone system, but it rattled LAX, but it didn't fully destroy it. But the results on the remote viewing were like it was a wreck. So that actually led me to think, we've been getting results that really indicate whenever we look at the future, it looks like we get like a different reality. But when we remote view the past, we don't get a different reality. Our remote viewing targets for the past are always correct and the present are always correct. But the future ones sometimes are off in situations like this. So that actually led to a very long, year-long study called the Multiple Universe Project, where we were explicitly testing for the existence of multiple realities. And lo and behold, that study turned out to be tremendously successful, absolutely confirming the idea of multiple realities. And the data were published in a major peer-reviewed scientific journal called the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And if you go to our website, farsight.org, www.farsight.org, there's a link on the website where you can actually see the article, which is there's a little banner there saying latest peer-reviewed published research. You click on that and you'll see a PDF of the article. So that's how we did that. See, the LAX earthquake, the interpretation was that we were not wrong. What we actually did was we saw that the viewers are able, when you go into the future, when you go into the past, you sort of know which version of the past you want to. For example, the sinking of the Titanic. You want the version of the past where the Titanic sunk, hit the iceberg. So you know which past timeline you want. But with the future, you don't know that. So when you remote view the future, you can get anything that happens. So you get an earthquake, but it's the wrong magnitude. So we exactly predicted the exact date of the earthquake based on analysis of the magnitude of the quake. But that meant on many different timelines, some of the timelines had major catastrophic earthquakes, and some of them had minor rumbles. And we were sort of in the middle there someplace. So even that, if you consider that to be our worst prediction or our worst experiment, even that wasn't bad. So when you look at these post-2012 Earth changes, the results are so unambiguous, and the controls that were used were so sophisticated in terms of randomization and controls for the various timelines were so complete that I personally think that the results are correct, and we're only some months away before we find out. And if the results do turn out to be correct, that will be the end of the game in terms of this scientific denial of the reality of the remote viewing phenomenon. So we're only months away from the end of this whole drama of science sort of denying it. It's real. And if the results don't turn out, well then they can continue to deny it, and I will simply have made a mistake, and we go back to the drawing board to try to figure out what's happened. But it will be the first major mistake in a long time. And so I wouldn't bet against us at this point.
You're talking about something that's got major consequences, given that you cited, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but you cited coastal lands, right?
Yeah, it turned out to be a coastal study mostly, so we don't have much data for the inlands. Now, the reason was we were looking at ecologically sensitive areas because we were looking for subtle climate change, so I had to pick targets that were vulnerable to climate change. And so you don't want targets that are deep inland at higher altitudes that no matter what happens are not going to be affected. You're trying to see if the remote viewers can pick up on subtle climate change. So the targets we used were Vaitupu Tuvalu in the South Pacific, an island, Fort Jesus, an old Portuguese fort in Mombasa, Kenya, right on the coast of Indian Ocean, in Africa, East Africa, the Sydney Opera House with that unique architecture in Sydney, Australia, Mount Kilimanjaro. That was a target where we were simply interested in knowing if there was the same level of snow at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. The United States Congress building in Washington, D.C., that's only 90 feet above sea level, and it's right on the coast. Male International Airport, Male, Maldives, that's at like 1 foot sea level. KITV building, one of our great remote viewers, Dick Allgaier, has just retired as a celebrity newscaster. He was a celebrity newscaster for decades at KITV in Honolulu, Hawaii. and say Key West, Florida. So we have data for all those places, and the results are absolutely unbelievable. And let me pause and sort of ask you where you want me to go with this, but I can sort of summarize what we
go ahead and summarize the results. That will give everybody a sense of where we're going to go with this.
Okay. Well, the basic idea is that we have an understanding at the time we did the study that we were probably dealing with something we really now confirmed, that we have multiple timelines or multiple realities that exist simultaneously with us. And actually, before I go into these results, let me say that for those people in your audience who are gagging right now and saying, how could that be? I strongly suggest you go to the website for the Farsight Institute and scroll down a little bit. That's www.farsight.org. And when I was out at Boulder, Colorado this summer, that talk that I gave was recorded. It's called Remote Viewing and Quantum Science, and you can see it on the website for free. Just click on it, and that will help explain the physics of how multiple realities could exist. Well, anyway, so what we have is a situation in which we start with June 1st, 2008, with all of those 9 targets, and we go to 2 separate timelines from June 1st, 2008 to June 1st, 2013. And those 2 separate timelines are separated by criteria. Now, the idea is that if it's impossible to predict the future because you don't know what timeline you're going to be on, because there's a forking or a branching out at every moment of the now, then it's impossible to predict the future. So what you can do under that hypothesis is say, well, let's look at a future in which XYZ occurs. And let's look at another future in which ABC occurs. And then we'll look at what current timeline we're on and say, are we more like XYZ or are we more like ABC in terms of what actually occurs? And then we can say, okay, well, if we're more like ABC, then our future is going to look like that timeline, or more like that timeline. Mm-hmm. And if things that occur sort of on the way are more like XYZ, then we'll say, well, it'll be more like the first timeline. So we have 2 timelines, timeline A and timeline B. And timeline A is June 1st, 2013, following the timeline in which the leadership of the mainstream global scientific establishment continues to ignore or deny the reality of the remote viewing phenomenon and the existence of life not originating from Earth. That could be any life, including microbial. Now,
these are criteria points that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That those things have to happen before June 1st, 2013. So they're going to continue to ignore or deny the reality of remote viewing. And timeline B...
Can I just... Why is that an important part of your criteria?
Okay, because let me explain timeline B, and then I'll say why that's important.
Okay, great.
And that's perfect. Timeline B is the same time, June 1st, 2013, following the timeline in which by the end of 2009, which is not our timeline, it already passed, leaders of the mainstream scientific global establishment publicly recognized the reality of the remote viewing phenomenon and the existence of life not originating from Earth. The reason this is that if the global scientific establishment, or some major elements of it, did recognize the reality of remote viewing, there would be a huge public global focus on the studies that we have done. And that would potentially change the way people respond to the Earth. Meaning they might physically treat the Earth differently or act differently among themselves based on that new understanding of who we are, why we're here. They look at the other stuff that we do. And so the idea is that if there was a wide global recognition of the reality of remote viewing, it might be picked up in how the climate changes because people are responding to the Earth differently.
Okay.
That was the idea behind it. Now, it turned out to be a wonderful criterion to use based on what we actually found. We were not expecting to find what we found. So now we're in a situation where we have really strong results, and whether the mainstream scientific community ignores or denies the reality of remote viewing, or whether it acknowledges it, will make a major difference in how we encounter these events. Anyway, the basic events that you wanted me to talk about were in the post 2012 or sometime before June 1st, 2013. We see the following physical changes across all of those different geographical areas, and again, many of them are coastal. Impacts of what appear to be large meteors of all things, leading to, well, you might call them tsunamis, but they're more like displacement waves, which are waves that get much higher. Tsunamis are like a few feet high. The displacement waves can be like, hundreds of feet high. And possible volcanism. We also found extensive and forceful flooding of coastal areas, excessive solar radiation, and severe storms and weather. Now, in terms of the changes on humans in these data for that mid-2013 timeline, we found massive self-organized relocation away from coastal areas. These are refugees we're talking about. And the breakdown of the rescue or notable governmental functioning. And all of these data, and I'll explain how much data. This is the largest data collection project ever conducted at the time, using really highly sophisticated remote viewers who had trained, say, a decade or more in the use of these procedures, and who had extraordinary public track records dating back years where people could see what work they had done for many, many years. Mm-hmm. So you could actually, it's not a situation where someone comes on late night radio and says, I asked my remote viewers to do this and this is what they saw, and just says it. We don't know who those viewers are. We don't know the conditions under which the viewing took place. We don't know how the tasking was done. So it's hearsay. You can't believe any of it. But this is a situation where the viewers themselves had huge public track records, and we publicly discussed and presented all of the methods by which we were collecting these data, and had a public verification process for the collection of the data, which I'll mention in a second. Anyway, so we also found in all of these sessions, which is well over 113 sessions, there was not a single rescue helicopter, there was no National Guard, it was just gone. With the complete breakdown of the food supply system, no grocery stores were working. The complete breakdown of the vehicular transport system. People were hoofing it, walking. And extensive loss of buildings near the coast. Now again, this is a biased study because we looked mostly at coastal data, so we don't really know what's going on inland. But these were like amazingly huge results, so we don't have to worry about this like subtle change. From a scientific perspective, forget about the impact on the planet, but from a scientific perspective, it's ideal because it's a really clear binary result. So if any of these things do happen, and we have detailed data for those large locations, which I can talk about, then the issue of whether remote viewing is real is over, and we run into a second problem. The second problem is that once people become aware that remote viewing is real, they'll also become aware that many elements in the scientific community, many people, were cooperating with governments in the preparation for these events. There are many preparations that have been going on.
Yes.
And when we look at times of chaos, times of great tumult, the populace often gets very frustrated. Look at the revolution of the French Revolution, and in the late 1700s, in the late 1700s.
Right.
What you had there was the reign of terror, where they were chopping off people's heads, aristocrats, everybody. And they weren't listening to leaders, governmental leaders, or science leaders. They weren't listening to anybody. And so that was only stopped by Napoleon when he came aboard. So what we run the risk of is that people would turn away from not just governments. Everyone knows governments lie to us. Not our government, all governments. No matter where you are, their job is to control the masses, and they'll say whatever they have to say to control the masses. But the scientific community would have been involved in keeping a lot of this information quiet. And so we're running the risk of having the masses turn away from the scientific community as well, and thus we'd enter an age in which is potentially a turning away from the age of reason. And I'm a scientist, and I don't want that. So I think it's really in the interest of the mainstream scientific community, since it's going to be over anyway in a few months, to acknowledge the reality of remote viewing now, so that after these events are encountered, if the events do happen, then we can all proceed together into creating a new humanity, a new, better earth, a new place with an age of reason guiding us, where science is there hand in hand. And so some of the evidence that you sort of look at for preparations is obvious. For example, the U.S. completely shut down its manned spaceflight program. That's amazing. I mean, we have been in space since the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. We just gave up.
Basically, my entire lifetime, we've been in space. Yeah.
It's amazing, and they're presenting it like the NASA scientists just woke up one morning and said, "Oh my gosh, we forgot to get a replacement for the space shuttle. What are we going to do? How did this happen?" But these PhDs need to pay for their mortgages just like you and I do. So it's just not credible that they simply forgot. And then you have the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is now finished and fully stocked, where every agricultural seed on the planet is in a vault that's nuclear bomb proof, tsunami proof, displacement wave proof, everything proof, in the islands in northern Norway. And you could say this is just sort of a quirky Norwegian project, but if that's true, why did the head of the United Nations with all of his staff formally inspect the facility? I mean, something's going on. And then we have the U.S. global debt. Now, all the presidential politics that's going on right now is interesting, talking about the debt. The reality is we're in so much debt, nobody can pay it off.
Right.
So the question is, they're obviously pulling out all the... They're going into more debt. There's no way we can pay it, period. And it's just piling on more after more. It doesn't matter who's president. So the idea is that it's not just us, but also Europe. People seem to be pulling the economic resources out of the economy as quickly as possible. Sort of like there's going to be a global reset or something. And then there's digging all over the place. For example, we have these huge underground facilities under our military bases in the inhospitable regions of the West that the masses cannot get to.
Well, there's bases all over the country. There's bases not that far from my backyard here in Pennsylvania. They're under the whole Northeast corridor. Yeah. Yeah,
but they don't advertise where those are, and the masses really don't have an ability to get into them should something happen. On the other hand, Russia and China, now I'm not criticizing any country, especially not my own. It's just that there's differences in cultures. The United States tends to focus on the elite and the military in terms of overall protection, while China and Russia tend to focus on the masses.
Which have both countries which have huge building projects inland that look like they could house millions of people.
Exactly. China, for example, is building subway systems that are up to 200 miles of subways under each of its major cities, and it's a 24-hour, 365-day-a-year project. The shifts are 12 hours for every worker. And it's a crash program that's supposed to be finished this year, like in a month. And you can sort of say, well, why the rush? Why not stretch it out over another 2 years or 20 years? But it doesn't make sense. Russia in 2011 decided to add another crash program of 5,000 new nuclear bomb shelters for Moscow alone. They already have 5,000, so they're adding another 5,000 in a crash program that has to be finished this year, like in a month. And that is complementing its subway system, which is built deeper than normal to be able to house all residents of, say, Moscow and other cities. And you can sort of say, well, with all this digging going on, nobody has any nuclear enemies, except for the possible exception of Israel and Iran in the future. But for right now, the U.S., China, Russia, there are no nuclear enemies. So why all this digging? It doesn't make any sense. So, and then NASA is now predicting that we're going to have unprecedented solar storms in 2013, repeated Carrington events that will potentially knock out computers and power grids and things like that. Well, how come we can't even predict the weather on Earth a week in advance? How can we predict, years in advance what's going to happen on the sun? And they say it's sort of tied into the 11-year cycle of the sun. But there was that 11-year cycle hit in 2001 and 1990, and we had lots of computers in both of those years. How can they predict something unprecedented? But they're saying it with such certainty. So, and there are other things going on as well. That's not the only list, but it gives you an idea that if these events actually do occur, people are going to say, that many elements of the scientific community knew it and helped the government in preparing for these things. And my concern is that the masses would turn away from basically everybody, and that's not good.
This was why I was so puzzled by this challenge that you put out and why you attached it to your criteria for the RV program that you were doing here. Because, first off, we know that as early as the 1970s, some scientists were embracing this. I mean, anybody can go and look up Russell Targ and realize that, there was an acceptance of this, even if it was just at Stanford Research. The other side of it is that it looks like science is compartmentalized in a way that on some stratum there are scientists who seem to have the ability to stretch with this, while the scientists that are being produced out of mainstream science curricula are educated out of this. In other words, you said yourself, you have scientists who are struggling with the mathematics behind quantum theory. They may understand the theoretical and the hard numbers, but the basic idea of non-locality completely escapes them. Their reality simply can't deal with it.
It's the interpretation of quantum mechanics that's in dispute.
Yeah. So we have different stratum of scientists, but what I would consider to be mainstream science would not veer to this direction because it threatens their reality. It threatens the constructs under which they work every day. So I was baffled by why this was important and why it mattered. And you kind of assuaged some of that because I was kind of almost perturbed. Well, why is he pegging it to this? Because
look at it this way. If I had written the targets such that a timeline in which the leaderships of the governments continued to ignore or deny, that wouldn't ever work because the governments never act proactively for things like this. They always respond to what the people sort of have happened to them already. So the governments are never going to come out and say, okay, everybody, it's time to wake up, remote viewing is real. What's going to happen is the scientific community is going to be the first one who acknowledges it. And then the governments will follow after that.
But aren't most scientists really, most basic research is done at universities and most funding is pegged to either government and or corporate financing. So don't we have a problem with that, Courtney?
Yeah, we have a huge problem. In fact, there's a huge problem in the university systems because most of the university systems, all the major research, or almost all of the major research universities are essentially financed by the healthcare system now. Yeah. So it used to be that colleges and universities were places where
free inquiry. It was basically a place where you could go and it was open.
Yeah, and you had undergraduate education that was the focus. So universities became known for the quality of their undergraduate education, and then they became later known for how well their graduate schools were doing and so on. But now they're known for how good their hospitals are. And that's where all the money is. The money is in the healthcare system. And the colleges, the undergraduate colleges, are really more of an afterthought now. They're sort of the abandoned child that is making a little bit of racket because it doesn't get enough resources. But no one really sort of takes it as seriously as before because it's not bringing in big cash. You see, the colleges, the 4-year undergraduate colleges, are essentially financed by the tuitions of the students. Whereas the healthcare system is financed by government and corporate dollars. which are huge. I mean, it completely dwarfs anything that the students bring in with tuitions. So you have this huge cash cow, and the last thing you want is for some person to say, some person, for example, might have been saved in a cancer treatment, who owns, say, a chain of car washes, to call up and say, hey, I was going to give you guys $1 million, but you've got this guy talking about remote viewing and perhaps even extraterrestrial life, and hey, I don't think that's cool. I don't like that. I'm not going to send you that check.
Yeah.
So, the universities are very sensitive because universities are not paradigm busters. People are paradigm busters. Universities are resource aggregators, meaning they aggregate resources so that people can do research. But the money resources are primarily in healthcare, and so that's where all the major research is. It's in healthcare stuff. And so we have a real problem, and this includes a problem with physics, because within the physics community, the dominant area is, especially on the quantum level, is in string theory.
Yes.
String theory has lots of potential, but it's also got tremendous challenges as well. String theory has yet to produce an absolute solid prediction with a result, meaning most science says you have a theory giving rise to a prediction, and that gives rise to a result. And the result then confirms the theory, because there was a prediction in between. And string theory has yet to do that. Now there's been talk about maybe it's getting close with this so-called God particle that the new collider is looking for, but really that's not going to settle matters. The issue is that scientists really don't know and understand the correct way to interpret quantum mechanics, and the money that goes into physics is almost entirely monopolized by the string theorists. So if you're a non-string theorist, you basically don't have much of a chance of getting a job in a major peer-reviewed, in a major prestigious university in the physics department. You really have to be adopted by one of the string theory components in order to have a decent chance of employment. And so what you have is a lot of people who are ferociously spinning the wheel like rats in a cage running on the wheel, trying to prove string theory is right and pumping in whatever billions they have into that. But you don't have a lot of diversity of thinking within the physics community. You don't have a lot of people trying different ideas, thinking different ways. And that's the real problem. So you have, in general, the university system is primarily healthcare oriented, and in those areas such as physics, where you should be getting some new thinking, you have an unfortunate pile-up on one approach to...
Is this why we also seem to be atrophied in terms of energy research right now? I mean, it looks to me like one of the most pressing problems, assuming that the grid was going to continue and assuming civilization did not shift in some radical way, we're faced with huge problems related to energy, yet the embrace of any new energy technologies, and I do a fair amount of research into this, is almost zero. It looks like we're still retreading whatever petro-based technology we've had for 100 years now.
Yeah, the best way to look at this is to look at what happened during the Carter administration. During the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter basically instructed his
energy czar.
His energy czar to simply ignore current energy dominations and come up with a plan for the future. And so they came up with an energy plan that gave grants and tax incentives and all types of great, interesting things to alternative energies. Wind, solar, gas, not...
Solar, yeah, I remember this. My parents actually put solar panels on their house.
There was all types of incentives. In fact,
exactly.
that's when the laws passed that required power companies to purchase your electricity if you made it with a wind mill. Although before that they were simply refusing, and so that made tremendous change. And what happened in response to those 4 years of Jimmy Carter is that the costs, there was a tremendous amount of research and development, and the cost of all of these alternative sources of energy were dropping like rockets, aiming straight down. I mean, it was just collapsing, the cost of these alternative sources of energy. And the coal, gas, nuclear, traditional sources of energy, main people were absolutely petrified. And they funded and hugely supported the Reagan candidacy. Reagan got into office promising he would destroy the Energy Department, literally take it apart. Because it was a threat to the traditional sources of energy. And once he got there, he realized that rather than take it apart and risk it being resurrected in the future why don't you change it? And so rather than destroy it, he changed it into a support agency for nuclear, coal, gas, and all the traditional forms of energy, and simply eliminated all of the tax credits, the grants, everything for alternative were just pulled out by the roots to stop that research and development as fast as possible so that you don't get this competition. And so that's what the Obama administration has started to reinsert. Now, under the Bill Clinton administration, they actually didn't start that up again, precisely because Bill Clinton didn't want to run into the wall of the energy industry, like what happened to Jimmy Carter. So Clinton was a very savvy politician and said, I'm not going to fight that battle because I saw they rolled over Jimmy Carter with a bulldozer. I'm just not going to go there. And so he simply avoided that problem. And Obama has sort of gone a middle road. He's supporting a lot of offshore drilling. He's supporting the traditional sources of energy, clean coal stuff. So he's not doing what Jimmy Carter did, which is to try to do a full-scale 90-degree turn in another direction. But he's simultaneously offering support for green technologies. And so it's sort of a hybrid between the two approaches. And, it's a delicate line, because where there is money, there is a will to fight. And the mainstream energy industry, and I'm not criticizing, believe it or not, I am not criticizing the mainstream energy industry. I'm just saying that that's how you understand the politics. You look at the politics to learn where the money is, and that's where the energy will be, the political energy, to be able to establish these battles and so on. Well, and you really have to understand, I'm not criticizing the energy industry.
I understand that. Let's turn this in the loop a little bit, because really the same thinking that keeps us locked into what I call black energy, meaning what we draw out of the earth in some way, is the same mindset that does not accept remote viewing, that will not probably accept and may even actively suppress the findings that you've come up with, because it's a locked-in mindset. So we have a problem. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because we're coming up on an hour here, we're going to take a break. If, for instance, the embrace of remote viewing and the attendant consequences of that occurred by mainstream science tomorrow, what would be the implications in terms of the media and then the general public? Because now you're dealing with perceptual levels that have been baked into the public consciousness for as long as everybody's been alive, and you've got a media that I'm not sure is willing to accept nor is open enough to report such a thing. What would it look like?
Well, first of all, the masses are different from the mainstream media. The mainstream media is again orchestrated by the people who have money to control those mainstream media. And again, I'm not criticizing. I'm glad they have the money to have these major industries going. And so they have these major industries, and they're protecting those industries by making them, hew to a certain line. However, if there was look, Randy, to be quite honest, if it wasn't for the fact that these post-2012 stuff were going, the issue would not be forced. And we could go on another 100 years denying the existence of remote viewing. It's only because these events seem to be coming that the reality of remote viewing is going to become so obvious that the mainstream scientific community won't be able to ignore it. So what will happen if they do acknowledge it? Well, the first thing that will happen is that there will still be a gasp from the mainstream media outlets. They're very reactive. They're not proactive. They will sort of think it's sensational at one point. They'll not know what to do with it on another point. They'll be frightened a little bit about getting caught into something that could turn out to be scandalous. So the very first thing that we are going to have to do is conduct a public demonstration of remote viewing using all of our scientific controls, which we've mastered over the last 15 years. We finally figured out and done repeatedly public demonstrations of remote viewing that are so unambiguous that they'll turn anybody around. So we know how to do that. We'll conduct those public demonstrations of remote viewing that will have unbelievably nice controls. Some that we've done before. It won't be a surprise to anyone who's watching us.
So that's
and that will sort of crack the ice. And then what I'm expecting to happen afterwards is that some scientists will say, they'll look at something, I don't know what it is, but they'll say, they cheated. This didn't happen. And so we're going to probably be asked to do it again. And then we will do it again. And it'll be over and over until it becomes sort of an iterative getting used to it. And then eventually we'll say, look, conduct your own demonstrations. We've shown you how it's done. You don't have to believe us. But the demonstrations we do will have all of the scientific controls. But no matter how many scientific controls you put in, there'll still be somebody who comes up and said, you must have had something implanted in your brain that had a little transceiver in it that was whispering things in your ear that nobody saw. They'll come up with some crazy idea.
It's always a rigged game, right? Because we're dealing with a perceptual level that still can't accept the realities that are beyond programming right now.
But our response to that will be, fine, that's fine. You can say that if you want. Here, do a brain scan. You can see that. And now let's do another demonstration. So we'll do it again. So the idea is, and then we'll have to eventually take this on the road and go to various countries around the world and do demonstration after demonstration and let people see it and get used to it until it sort of sinks in. And then, Randy, we will have a planet that is not recognizable compared to what we have today.
Yeah. Let's take a break at this point and come back on the other side. Talk a little bit more about the experiments that you conducted and what that went into, because I know there's some interest in that. And we'll also talk a little bit more at length about some other work that you've done, including the Remote Viewing of Jesus project. And so we'll take a break here at this point and come back on the other side and talk a little bit more about remote viewing and some of the other interesting things with my guest, Courtney Brown. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second hour of Offplanet Radio Live. I'm Randy Moggins. My guest with me tonight is Courtney Brown. We are talking about remote viewing, and I know there were some people out there that were questioning it. We went kind of a little off of it, but there were good points to be made, and there's a lot of interviews out there with Courtney, and he goes into a lot of detail about it, and our conversation goes where it goes. I don't come in with an agenda. So a very interesting topic that we've been talking about, and Courtney, you're there with me again.
Yeah, the only thing I might sort of wrap up our post-2012 Earth changes study, which really started out as a climate project study, is that to understand the complexity of the study so that it's simple, and you understand how profound it is, I really strongly recommend people to get the DVD, The Farsight Experiments. It's on our homepage, www.farsight.org. And it's not just one study, but you have to look at all the other studies we've done to make sense out of the multiple timeline stuff and the idea that major sudden changes is the norm. It's not the thing that hardly ever happens. And the other thing I wanted to add was give you an idea, just a hint of the type of controls that were used to get our study. When we did this study, we had a large group of remote viewers that are the best military-grade remote viewers on the planet with public verified track records who had studied these military or military-derived procedures for, say, typically a decade or more. We had assigned them sessions to do, but when they were doing the sessions in the first half of 2008, the targets were not assigned to those sessions, meaning time really doesn't exist, so it didn't matter when we assigned the targets. So they were doing sessions one after the next, and we were putting them all up on the website, encrypted to 56 military-grade encryption, so no one could see them, but they could hold them on their hard drive. They could download them and hold them on their hard drive so that they know we couldn't cheat. And tens of thousands of people all over the planet downloaded them and held them. And then we also had a rule that was needing to be made to say we had 27 targets, which session would be associated with which target. So if someone's first session that they did, the question is what target would be associated with? Would it be Tuvalu? Or would it be KITV building in Honolulu? Or would it be Sydney Opera House in Australia? And also which time period? 2008 or 2013, one of the two timelines. So it was a possible total of 27 possible targets. 9 locations and 3 different time points. That's 27 top possible targets. So if you do all those sessions, you have to have a rule that says session 1 is going to be associated with, say, target 3, or session 2 will be associated with target 14, for example. So you have to have some rules. So what I did was I used a computer program to come up with a random jumbled association between the sessions and the targets. And so you'd have a rule. Session 1 is associated with target 20, session 2 is associated with target 3, things like that. And then I used that same computer program to come up with 999 different versions of that jumbled rule.
Okay.
So now the thing was, I took that file and put it up on the website in an encrypted form. No one could see it, but on that file at the top, there was a statement saying, which one of these 999 rules will tell you which session is associated with which target will be determined by the last 3 integer digits of the closing Dow Jones average for June 4th, 2008. And so all of the sessions were put up way before that, like in April and May at the latest of 2008. And then we waited, and this rule with all 999 versions of it was put up like early 2008, encrypted, and so on. And then we waited till June 4th, and then I gave out the password, put it on the website, so people could look at that file. And at the top of that file it said, the Dow Jones number for the last 3 integer digits, look at that, and that will tell you which one of these rules works. Everyone zipped to CNN or someplace to get the Dow Jones closing average for June 4th. And the last 3 integer digits, I think it was 243 or something like that. So you went back to the file and looked at the 243rd rule, and that was the one that told you which session was associated with which target. So the point is, it was physically impossible for anyone, including me, anyone on the planet Earth, to know which session was being associated with which target at the time they were doing their sessions. It was perfect, squeaky clean, scientific. And the point is, these data were conducted under those perfect conditions, so that when we got the results, this is why it was so surprising. Out of the 113 sessions, that was for these quality remote viewers, nothing like this had ever been tried before. Those many good remote viewers, public track records, knowing who they were, that works. This is not hearsay where you just have somebody saying, my remote viewer saw X, Y, Z. This is where the data were held by the public, the target associations was held by the public, everything was totally randomized, wasn't determined until the Dow Jones number happened, and that happened after everybody had all the data. I mean, it was perfect. When it was all looked at, and we got the Dow Jones number and got the rule and looked at it and put it up on the web, the 200 of the 2008 sessions, they were for the 2008 time period, there were 37 sessions, and out of those, only 2 had any flavor of disasters or any type of 2 out of 37 only had any flavor of, that was essentially 0. For the timeline A, which is where the scientific community continued to ignore or deny the reality of remote viewing, 20 out of the 38 sessions for that time period had total, complete wipeout disasters. Total, complete. And out of the timeline B, where the scientific community did recognize the reality of remote viewing, it was a little better, 17 out of 38. So basically,
so we were in, as you went through this, then we were also in a progression paralleling the actual remote viewing itself. In other words, there was a progression to this.
Yeah, in fact, when you look at it, it's a binary result. There's essentially no disaster content in 2008, but in 2013, more than 50% of the sessions had total wipeout disasters. And Randy, this is the key. It was impossible for anybody when they were doing the sessions to know whether they were doing a 2008 or 2013 session.
Okay, so
nobody could have known that.
So let me say that maybe this makes it easier, because I know this is tough for people to understand. There's a deterministic aspect to what you were using. In other words, the fact that as we move through the RV thing, I guess you call it a control factor, accept or not accept remote viewing became a determinant in the outcome between the 2 timelines.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. In
that's
fact,
spacey stuff. That's hard for people to wrap their minds around.
In fact, what it tells you is that these futures exist right now. In a deterministic way, these futures are there. There is a future where the scientific community continues to ignore, deny the reality of remote viewing, and there is another future where, even as early as 2009, they did publicly recognize. Now, if, for example, before the end of this year, I'm just saying that as an example, there was some type of mainstream recognition of remote viewing as real, then we would be more like that timeline B, where the reality, even though timeline B said it hadn't by the end of 2009, the fact that it did happen before 2013, June 1st, makes us more like that timeline B. So, and the results did seem to indicate that it did help a little bit. Actually, significantly it helped with the results, but I mean, there were still the major disasters, but there were people cooperating more in the second one. Anyway, so what it basically says is that those existences deterministically do exist, but Randy, this is the key. We live in a free will probabilistic universe. So you can say, how can we live in a free will probabilistic universe if these realities exist in a deterministic way? Because we have free will to decide which reality we're going to want to experience. That's the key. You see, we can steer ourselves. These realities may exist. That's what I've been
saying for a long time. Yeah.
These realities may exist, but we don't have to experience certain ones. Another version of us will experience it, but we don't have to experience it. We can change the direction. We can, for example, that you're driving down a road, and you have many intersections, and you have the opportunity to drive down any one of those intersections and going off in any direction. Those roads all exist, but you get to decide which road you choose. By choosing one road doesn't mean that the other roads don't exist. They are still there, just that you're choosing not to experience them in this particular reality. And that gives us free will. And by bringing this information from the future back in time, we allow ourselves a level of control in the evolution of our life. of our existence on this planet.
Yes.
That we didn't have before when we were blind to all of this.
One of the questions that was presented on the chat room, I'll just kind of drop this out here. Do the people who tell the remote viewers the target, I guess that would be the monitors, know what the target is? Or is remote viewing a double-blind test where they do not know the target in advance?
Well, that's a great question. It differs depending on who's doing it, what studies. In all of our studies, we don't use a monitor. So in our studies, the sessions are done blind with no monitor. Now, our studies typically go, for example, the climate study goes way beyond double blind. Double blind means that not only do you not know the target, that's considered blind when you're remote viewing, but you don't know the target. That's a minimal thing. But you also don't know anything about the person assigning the target. Okay, our studies go beyond that because the targets don't even exist at the time that the sessions are being done. Meaning the targets are being assigned not by a person, any person. The targets are being assigned by the Dow Jones number that's picking them out of a
and that's what I was going to ask you.
99. So it goes way beyond double blind.
So these are not coordinates, and these are not, as were done back in the early days, random number generators.
No, for example, in the old days, they used to have a monitor, which is a person sitting in front of the remote viewer, and the monitor used to know the target.
Right. And
used to give them the target coordinates that were often geographical coordinates with latitude and longitude. And none of that happens anymore.
Okay. What information then does the remote viewer have before they proceed into a session?
Okay, that's very good to know. They get an email. It's usually not anything face-to-face. No, they don't see the person or talk to the person verbally or anything. They get an email saying, there is a target, please begin. That's it. And these are professional people, so they know that that's all they're going to get, and they go and do their thing. In ideal situations, they go into a room, go cool down, they have a stack of paper and a pen, and in ideal situations, the room has got no pictures on it. Any recording stuff is done put behind the person. The room has got a table in it that's in the center of the room, facing a corner, and not up against a wall. Mm-hmm. Things like that. But people have different situations. But ideally, it's nice, and they just start doing their procedures and come out an hour later with 10 to 20 pages of detailed data describing the target.
Okay. So
now, the target may not exist at the time they do it, but it's describing some target, and at some point in time in the experimental design, the session was going to be associated with the target, and then somebody gets to compare the session to the target.
Okay. Now, you have pretty well-defined methodology for remote viewing, both in the way you teach it at Farsight and also the way it was performed in the military in terms of protocols.
Actually, Randy, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
We haven't actually taught remote viewing since the late 1990s.
Okay.
We have actually been
so you're not doing any teaching anymore with artists?
Actually, I personally have a free 18-hour, 24-lesson audio course that's available on the Institute's website on scientific remote viewing. But the people we have been working with over the last 6 or some odd years have been people who have been trained by, say, Wheaton at the Hawaii Remote Viewrs Guild. He was out of Special Forces Intelligence. Or Lyn Buchanan, who was out of Defense Intelligence Agency. And it's basically their viewers. And the reason is that we needed to... when you specialize in certain things, you get more things done. So they were great at teaching the remote viewing, and we were able, at the Institute, we were able to focus on the creation of the scientific experiments, the projects. So it's hard to do everything. And so with limited manpower, with everyone volunteering. So we are expecting to actually train again, and we're making plans to do that in Asia as well as in Africa. But for right now, I just wanted to establish that the Institute, the Farsight Institute, is really more of a science shop than it's been a teaching shop.
All right, good. Okay, I can still go here in terms of all of the remote viewers utilized in this project are using a standard protocol, and that protocol is the same across all of the different trainers and the different viewers, correct?
No, there's two major styles.
Okay.
One is Hawaii Remote Viewrs Guild, which uses a style that comes out of the intellectual sort of genius for that is a guy called Dr. Richard Ireland. Whereas Lyn Buchanan's style comes out of Defense Intelligence Agency, and the sort of intuitive genius that is the grandfather of that one is Ingo Swann.
Yes.
So, but there's similarities between the styles.
Okay, so how do the remote viewers begin to enter state, go into the place where they're going to remote view? Do you use distraction methodology, or how does that happen?
Well, sometimes in the teaching process we do, just to get some initial experiences going so people can sort of believe that it happens. So if they get a few good results, they'll say, oh my gosh, and then they settle down. Mm-hmm. But for professional remote viewers, they don't do that. For professional remote viewers, they start with a cool down period, which is to calm your mind down so it's not so noisy. I typically start all of my remote viewing sessions. I typically don't do remote viewing for these projects because I'm the chief investigator. But when I do remote viewing, I typically start with meditation. I do the TM Cities program, which is the advanced version of transcendental meditation. Okay. Other people doing remote viewing sometimes listen to music of a certain type. Sometimes the Monroe Institute has some hemisync tapes that they like listening to, things like that. Other people sit calmly in a chair with their eyes closed for 15 minutes, various things. But there's a cool down period. And then they mechanically start going through the process. And it normally involves writing something called a ideogram as a response to something called target coordinates. But the target coordinates are generally created by the remote viewer herself or himself right then and there on the spot. They're not given to them by us. And they just start doing the procedure. So from an outside perspective, it looks like they're doing this all out of thin air. Like they're given no information, they just sit down, they start doing these procedures. So it doesn't look like they've got anything to work with. But when they're done an hour later, they have really, really detailed data that is absolutely unambiguous. This is not like college kids who have been given a half-hour pep talk on how to do remote viewing. These are people who have trained for a decade or more. And so these people's remote viewing results are absolutely clear, unambiguous, verbal and graphical descriptions with great sketches of the target and its unique target aspects. So there's no ambiguity. They're describing exactly that target. And that's what happens. That's how that's done. It's done in a very calm state, but it's not an altered state like hypnosis or out of body. It's not that.
Okay. And, for me, that was just, I wanted to know that because I have done a bit of remote viewing. I've done it from a couple different aspects, and I'm always curious to know how these guys are doing it.
Well, it's a natural.
Yes.
A set of data that we have automatically in our own minds, and the remote viewers are simply taught to pay attention to those data that are normally ignored by us. So normally this stuff happens to us all the time, but we focus on conscious mind activity and we sort of shunt that other stuff aside, and the remote viewers are taught to not shunt it aside, but to look at it.
Another question that's been asked is, are you personally preparing for what's coming?
Yes and no. There's a level of physical preparation which I am not doing because I have no resources to do it. So I only have my house, which is in Atlanta, probably the worst place to be, a major city if the grid goes out, grocery store stuff. I don't have the money to buy anything or to go anywhere right now, so this is just me. On the other hand, I'm psychologically preparing by getting used to the idea that this stuff is in the future. And I did do simple things like have a physical exam, make sure my vaccinations are up to date. Same with my son, my wife, and things like that. But that's it. So I really I don't have any recommendations for people. I did create a bug out bag just in case. That was sort of fun. That was sort of a fun thing to do. And if nothing happens by mid-2013, I have, and my son has some nice new camping equipment. But other than that,
well, no, and we've been preparing bug out bags and psychological preparation in this house for 9 years, long before this, because there's been this sense in a lot of different areas that something's coming, and just preparation. And I'll just say this: I used to be a Boy Scout leader. I taught preparation, so why would I not practice it?
Yeah, so we have, for example, I have my son and myself and my wife, we have the ability to go, but we have no place to go. Does that make sense?
No, I actually kind of do understand that. Another person was asking about, basically the term predictions comes up. And, in my mind, that word is so slippery. But you actually don't use the word prediction so much as probabilistic or probability. Is that correct?
Well, in this particular case, yes. In this particular case, we have clear predictions for the future for the post-2012 period. However, there are predictions for those timelines, neither one of which are our timelines. So what we are saying is that depending on what the mainstream scientific community does, we will be more like timeline A or more like timeline B. And thus, we are indirectly predicting. So not exactly predicting, but we're saying we're going to be indirectly predicting what our timeline will be like. The theory here is that to make a prediction, Randy, is essentially impossible for small things. Because a small thing, like what color shirt you have, that really affects hardly any other timelines. So it just doesn't have any leverage across timelines. But a bigger thing like an earthquake will affect more timelines, meaning some timelines will have a small earthquake, some timelines will have a major earthquake, but around that same day there'll be some earthquake. And the idea is the bigger of the event, the more timelines are sucked into it. So this event, which looks like it's an event of a planetary nature, it's not event of a simple person doing one thing, but the whole planet's involved in this. This is a humongous event, so the theory is that with a big event like this, you can make a prediction. Because with a big event like this, essentially all timelines get sucked into it like a juggernaut.
Okay.
And that's why we can say that in this case, we're making a prediction. Because the event is so large, it's hard to miss it. It's like driving into the barn door. You just can't miss it. It's too big.
So you're basically saying that at some level, this becomes an event horizon and it becomes unavoidable globally on...
Yes.
Or is it a convergent timeline? In other words, and I've talked to other people who are remote viewers and even people that were in Looking Glass and some of the other government projects, and they've said that basically, there's a singularity where timelines converge into one consistent timeline that then is the event.
Yes, that's what it looks like. And I think the key is that the larger the event, the more you have that type of convergence. And the smaller the event, the more divergence you have, and it's almost impossible to predict the future. So this is a very key thing. Now, the reason I can say this is we did that multiple universes project that lasted for a year, and the data and the results were published in the Journal for Scientific Exploration, which is a leading peer-reviewed scientific journal. And again, people in your audience can see and read that article by going to our website, www.farsight.org, and clicking on the button that says latest peer-reviewed research, and you can read the article. So the idea is that we tested the notion that if there are multiple realities, the only way you could actually deterministically pick out and remote view a future reality would be if there was somebody in the future who absolutely experienced that reality in their past. That meant that we had to set up an experiment in which the sequence of events was first the remote viewing sessions would be done, and then some event would happen in the world, any event, and then after that, the tasker or the person who picked the target would pick the target. So let's say you have 3 months. You start with January. All the remote viewers, say all 10 of them, remote view a session and for a target. Now that target happens in February, so nobody knows what it is. It's not happened yet. No one knows what it's going to be. But in January, you take those sessions, you encrypt them, put them up on the web, let tens of thousands of people download them, and then you wait through all of February for some event to happen, any event. And then you wait till March, and then the tasker in March says, well, let me see here. I wonder when I'm going to assign all these remote viewers to remote view. And I'm going to pick it out of anything in the world that happened in February. Now, mind you, the sessions were already done, and they're on zillions of people's hard drives all over the planet. Mm-hmm. And the guy is in March saying, let me see what target I'm going to assign them. It sounds crazy. At this point, you probably need to go to a chiropractor because I've twisted your head around so much. But the idea is that the person in March then says, okay, I'm going to assign them... How about the tornado that whipped through Mino, Arkansas? That's a good one. Now, the tornado didn't even happen in January. It happened in February, and it wasn't even picked till March. But time doesn't really matter. So we take that tornado, put the target up on the web, plus a password to decrypt all sessions, and what do we get? Perfect sessions that describe the target, the tornado whipping through Mino, Arkansas. I mean, and we do this in a rolling way, month after month after month, and after a year of these things with very diverse targets, space shuttle landing, musical event, Macy's Day Parade, I mean, it goes on and on and on. It becomes very convincing, which is why they published it in the Journal for Scientific Exploration. Now, those were predictions in a sense. They accurately described, in a deterministic way, something that happened a month after the sessions were done. But in another sense, they weren't really predictions because we didn't know what the target was. So we had perfect descriptions of this future event, but we didn't know what the target was until March, until 2 months later. So a prediction is sort of when you say, tell me what's going to happen in 2013 at the Sydney Opera House. That's sort of a prediction. What we had was a thing where we had sessions that were perfectly describing what's going to happen in Sydney Opera House, for example, but we didn't know it was a session for Sydney Opera House. That wasn't determined until afterwards. But nonetheless, it did help us to fix the idea that the multiple realities existed, because the person who did the actual tasking, say in March, for that person, the target did exist. Even though it happened a month before that, it was still a month after the time that the sessions were done. So as long as the tasker knows for sure what the target is for his or her timeline, we can describe it exactly. Now, how does this climate project differ? This climate project differs because we're describing of an event without having that person in the future, what we call the temporal outbounder. Without having that person in the future pick the target. We're describing the target in advance of that happening. But we're getting around the problem of not being able to predict the future by saying we're not describing our future. We're describing the future of these two timelines. And then these two timelines we're going to compare with ours. And then then be able to see if we're closer to one than the other. It's a way to get around the prediction problem. And the issue is that if the event is sufficiently large, like it's global, then it moves to a point where you can say, okay, let's cut to the chase. We're going to make a prediction. It's a global event, so all the timelines have to funnel through it. So it's going to affect us. That's the situation we're in right now. So we're really testing that theory. So if these events do occur, then it will be, you have a theory, you have a prediction, and then you have a result. If these events are accurate, if these descriptions of the post-2012 world are accurate, then we will say we had a theory, we had a prediction, and we had a result. And that's all that's required in the scientific establishment and the scientific rules.
Assuming that 2013 rolls in and these events occur, we haven't embraced remote viewing, mass science remains stuck in the world of Newtonian physics, the media doesn't catch on, and we're dealing with mass catastrophes across the earth. Will remote viewing be remembered? You talked about the data on hard drives, but the kind of disaster that we're talking about, assuming that it is coming from outside the planet and generates enough EMP, is going to wipe all that electronics out. So do we have hard copies? Do we have, I know some people out there are talking about printing ceramic documents and things like that. Do we have a record that's going to be in the collective memory of the survivors of this to point back to remote viewing and to vindicate you?
Well, we don't. These data don't suggest the end of the world.
Right. I understand that.
They certainly do suggest a period where there is significant
disruption.
Hugely significant challenges and disruptions, but we're not saying the end of the world. And remind you also, this is an experiment. It's not a deterministic prediction. It's an experiment, and if we are correct, then we will be able to say we learned something, and that we are able now to make these deterministic predictions depending on the size of the event. But the basic thing is, I hope that before the end of the year, that we do have more resources. I do not think that we will be denied the ability to make a contribution to the future of humanity. So I am proceeding with the understanding, with the hope and the thought that we will be able to teach remote viewing in various areas of the world, including Asia and Africa in the post-2012 realm, and that we will have some ability to communicate back and forth to our results. And I'm expecting that even if I do not have the results at this particular moment, the resources at this particular moment, that the resources will come to me or come to us in time. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons I like to encourage people to buy the DVD, Farsight Experiments, or the other DVD which I've done, which we haven't talked about, called The Crucifixion Ruse.
Yeah,
that's its own website, crucifixionruse.com. That's it, and we have another project on the way. But the idea is when people buy the DVDs, they're literally supporting the future of remote viewing and helping to shape humanity into the future. So this is really helpful. What we're trying to do now is to get remote viewing expanded so that we have viewers in Asia, Japan, and China, as well as Africa. I'm heading the Africa launch. And the idea behind that is that remote viewing in the United States has really sort of reached its limit of what we can do.
I was going to ask you about that because I kind of suspected that that's what you were going to tell me.
We've done it for almost 20 years now, and it's not getting further.
Is there not some level of higher acceptance? I mean, you're around university students. My sense is that the younger generation in some way maybe is more accepting, given the fact that, well, maybe they just watch Fringe or something. I don't know. I just keep holding out for that.
You're correct. If you do a Google on remote viewing, there's approximately, in quotes, there's approximately 3 million websites for remote viewing. So remote viewing is out there. People are aware of it, and almost everybody starts with the free course that we have. No matter where they end up, they almost always start with the free 18-hour, 24-lesson course that's hosted by YouTube that we have, plus the printable text. And then they, if they want to go further, they get their own personalized trainers and so on. But the idea is that when we look at the future, we really don't see it starting from the United States moving outwards, but going actually outwards and moving back into the United States and Europe. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because we've really sort of run into a sort of the limit. And the first thing is that the authorities, the mainstream, the governmental authorities, really in the United States don't want remote viewing to be really out there.
Right.
Because they really want it as something that stays in the New Age bookstore community and is really peripheral to the mainstream issues. So, there's that. There's sort of if the bigger we get, the more likely the governmental resources will tap us down. And so there's sort of a limit to what you really can do in the United States. And in addition to the United States and Europe, there's also a financial problem that has nothing to do with the government. And that is that once you start teaching people to remote view, the first thing they want to do, and this is not a criticism, it's just the way the economics is they want to take some of the viewers that you've trained so they can go off and start their own place and become their own guru and teach their own students in a chase for the tuition dollars. And there's nothing wrong with that, but basically what happens is after you've invested a lot of time and energy and money teaching people, you lose them. They go away and they start their own thing and they won't do sessions for you anymore. And so that same process happens to them. And so what has basically happened is you get people doing remote viewing where they don't work with people for long. They cycle through constant newbies, constant new viewers.
This
people
is
want
Offplanet
to go for a 1-week course, and then after that they fill up another course for the 1-week course. But you don't get people who study with the same person for like 10 years in order to get really good in a dedicated manner. You get teachers who go through a constant cycle of newbie students and then they just go on. Because if they invest a lot of time in a few students, those students break away after a while and you lose them, and you sort of say, what good came out of it? Now, in Asia, there is a different culture. They have the money. They have money to chase after yen or whatever, but they have a culture where they like to work with their original teachers. So they like having their own dojo, just like everybody, but they also like having a continuity and to being able to do projects and to be involved with the original people that started things off. So you don't lose them, even though they'll go off and start their own place. And with Africa, it's a totally different setting. With Africa, they have, for example, in Kenya, they have a fully educated workforce. The educational system in Kenya is absolutely first rate, but they have absolutely no jobs. There is no money at all. So you have a fully educated workforce that speaks to King English, and there are no tuition dollars to chase. They can't run off and start their own dojo, to start their own group to chase tuition dollars, because nobody has any money to do anything. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be loyal viewers for you long into the future. And so that's why we're thinking of Asia and Africa as places where we can expand and work with people for the long run.
Hearing you talk about this, it seems like we have a cultural clash here in America of highly individualistic people and a value system that doesn't place a value on things that they perceive as esoteric or spiritual. I'll use that word because I consider remote viewing, you look at it as a scientific discipline and you went at it that way, which I think is useful. But at the end of the day, this is a spiritual pursuit, it's a spiritual discipline. And we in America don't value that. Or we have the TV preachers as role models for this, which is completely off the charts as well. So we're grappling with value systems that are sort of out of kilter. When you deal with the Asian cultures, there's an ingrained aspect of loyalty to, I think, teachers. And in Africa, like you said, we're dealing with beyond third world right now in terms of an economy.
Yeah, and it doesn't really matter who's doing the viewing. As long as you get the sessions in to do the experiments, we can change the world. But we have been dealing with the same number of... Right now there's fewer than 20 world-class viewers on the planet. And we just can't... We have to have like 2,000. We can't deal with 20.
Yeah. Well, when you're not talking, that's kind of a barometer, isn't it, of the critical mass of consciousness expansion that's occurring?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Many people think that remote viewing's new. I spent 10 years doing studies into scriptures, and I can locate remote viewing in the Hebrew Bible. And so this is not a new thing. There's a lot of arguments about whether it was weaponized by the military and the intelligence agencies because of some of the people, even some of the people that you work with. And I think there's an aversion to that within certain communities. But the fact of the matter is that they were the people that had the money to finance it.
Yeah. And we do have in the United States an extreme form of individualism. But on the other hand, that is what helped create the remote viewing phenomenon in the first place. Meaning it's because of that extreme form of individualism that you had people like Dr. Richard Ireland and Ingo Swann and creating these unusual things, and this level of individualism within the military that they decided to pick it up despite what the mainstream scientific community said and try it out and see if it works. And so that individualism actually helped in the creation of it. But on the other hand, that same level of extreme individualism is hindering the expansion of it. So we're not criticizing either side. We're just saying that we have to work to help the entire planet, the whole species, and we have to, do it in an intelligent way wherever it leads.
I want to leave open the opportunity here for callers. I still suck at this. Sorry, guys. Anybody out there that wants to call in, 717-910-0554. That's 717-910-0544. The numbers are actually posted on offplanetradio.net. And I think Dave's call-in numbers, and they've scrolled off my screen now, sorry, are posted as well. You can try the Wolf Spirit line, or you can try the Off-Planet Radio line. If somebody wants to call in right now, we'll take some questions. I'm going to go a little long here, Courtney, because I want to give you some time, because I did want to talk to you a little bit about the Jesus Project and what that's about.
Well, that's called the Crucifixion Ruse, and it has its own website, crucifixionruse.com, and remember, crucifixion is spelled with an X. And that also has its own DVD, but that is not an official project of the Farsight Institute. There was a project that I designed, and I asked Daz Smith, without him knowing anything about the nature of the project, to be the remote viewer for the project. I just said, there's a new project, would you do it? And he said, sure. So I assigned him a variety of sessions that he had to do for various targets. And he knew nothing about it. He knew nothing about an interest that I had in Jesus. He knew nothing about... he had been working for the Farsight Institute in our project for years and years and years. And he'd been given a whole string of verifiable targets like space shuttles landings, Macy Day parades, things like that. And so he was not expecting this at all. And what it was an experiment where we were testing a theory relating to the crucifixion. Now, the idea was actually raised by Jane Roberts and someone called Seth.
Yes, I'm familiar with this.
And the Jane Roberts books. And the idea was that it was said in the books that Seth said that Jesus himself was never actually crucified.
Yes.
But there was a conspiracy, and Judas took part in this conspiracy. And the whole idea was that Judas's role was to lead the authorities to a stand-in, and that this person was a mentally ill, deluded person who thought he was the Messiah. And basically a few of the disciples, not many, just like a couple, went up to him and said, you're right, you're the one, you are the guy. And by the way, we need to have a fulfilling biblical prophecy thing. We need to have a sacrifice. Someone needs to go through the sacrifice. You want to do it? You are the one. And the guy said, sure, I'll do it. And so they drugged him so he wouldn't feel so much pain. And Judas led the authorities to that person precisely so that they wouldn't go after the real Jesus. And that's why Peter denied him 3 times, because Peter wasn't in on the ruse, and he really didn't know the guy. And that's why they got rid of the body the next day, because that was incriminating evidence and the whole thing. And so it was,
You're going to piss a lot of people off here, aren't you?
Yeah, maybe so, but the point is, this was originally raised by Seth, who was a non-physical entity that was channeled by Jane Roberts. And I don't do channeling, but it's a very impressive set of books that is held in the Yale.
I've heard some of the original recordings as well. I've heard a lot of the Seth material,
And the Seth original manuscripts and all of their communications is held in the Yale University's Manuscripts and Archives Division. Everyone knows it's an unusual set of documents. And so I was raised as a Christian, so I sort of didn't believe that whole thing of this
I'd
stuff with Seth.
With it too,
But, the rest of the Seth books were so, there's 11 of them, were so closely matching to the minute detail of the things we found out about the nature of physical reality with respect to time and everything else, that I said, well, maybe this thing about Jesus was right. So I designed this thing as a sort of a whodunit project. So we targeted Judas at the Garden of Gethsemane. We targeted where Jesus was during the crucifixion, like was he on a cross or was he someplace else? We targeted all sorts of places. Like if you were a detective, you'd say, well, who was where at the moment of the crime? That type of thing. And Daz Smith was an expert who's worked for years with law enforcement with remote viewing. So he was perfect for doing criminal investigations. So this seemed like a typical type of investigation like that. Who was where at different times? Or where was who at different times, And so what we did was we did all of these sessions, and it turned out to be that all of the remote viewing data across all of these different targets completely corroborated the Seth version of events, and nothing corroborated the biblical version of events. And everything was done totally blind with one of the absolute best military grade remote viewers on the planet Earth, in a way that you just can't walk away from. And now, mind you, I've been a Christian my whole life, and I've been the cantor, soloist cantor in the Catholic Church here in Atlanta, and the Basilica, no less, for a very long time. I mean, the only thing higher than that is the priest.
Yeah.
I mean, I was the guy who would sing when they were giving out the body and the blood.
Wow.
I was the guy who was singing, the Mozart stuff and the Bach stuff, I was singing all of the. I was the guy doing the singing when they were doing the body and the blood stuff. And so for me to get these results was the only way I was able to do this is I was more curious to see the science of it than I was driven by the faith of it. So I said, I'm just going to have to see. I just have to see what's going on. Anyway, so at the crucifixionruse.com, www.crucifixionruse.com, it has its own website. There is a DVD. All the sessions are up on the website. All the targets are explained. The hypotheses are explained. But to get the full picture, it's a DVD that you get. And the first 22 minutes of the DVD, which explains the entire methodology, is actually on the website as a YouTube video. So you can actually watch the first 22 minutes and then sort of see how all the thing is sort of laid out. So before you buy the DVD, you sort of know what you're getting. And basically the targets are this. And by the way, Daz is not a new remote viewer. He is one of the best there ever was. And is on the planet now. And his descriptions are so unambiguous. And it's sort of bone-chilling when you hear him actually describe the stuff on the DVD, what his experiences were when he actually saw this. Also, it's very interesting because he did it totally blind. If you're upset by the project, you cannot blame Daz because he did everything blind. He didn't know what he was remote viewing. The only person you can blame is me because I was the one who designed the project in the first place. So,
but you didn't go into this project with that outcome in mind, did you?
No, in fact, I thought it was so ridiculous because I just have been told this stuff. But the reality is the actual Gospels, the four Gospels, were written over a period of like 150 years after the death of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so those Gospels were sorted and sifted and strained by the church for a very long period of time. Many things were rejected by the church and not included in the Bibles. I mean, think of soup that has been highly strained so that only the ingredients that they want are in there. That's what the Bible actually is. And there's only the Gospel of John that absolutely says that Jesus was like God.
Yeah.
As a son of God. Yeah. The other Gospels don't actually say that.
Well, and then you go into the Gnostic books and you have completely different stories that have baffled people.
And there's
the
Gospel of Judas, which is, anyways, these results, when you look at it in the end, what you end up seeing is that Jesus was a much more interesting, much more wonderful, and much more incredibly great being than anything the church says. And you have to see the whole DVD to understand why I can say that after you hear that that the crucifixion didn't happen the way it did happen. It just wasn't him. And so you can sort of say, well then, if it's a ruse, that destroys Jesus. But actually, if you understand the whole picture, it makes Jesus into a really much bigger deal. But you have to understand the whole picture. So Jesus was there. We looked at him at the end of his physical existence, and he was at the end of his physical existence. He was surrounded by his disciples, and they were off the scale in terms of excited. They knew something major was happening. They knew that the world was going to change. It was so. And this guy, Daz Smith, is the first person to actually poke his head in and actually see Jesus and all of these people doing this stuff. We also have, we did the target was Judas Iscariot during the actual betrayal, the famous Garden of Gethsemane scene. And there was clear criteria for being able to figure out whether he was trying to betray Judas or whether he was actually trying to help someone that was far away, who was not actually in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus wasn't there. And also we have another target, which is Jesus at the time of the so-called betrayal. So during the Garden of Gethsemane scene, where was Jesus? Well, he wasn't at the Garden of Gethsemane. And in the DVD, I clearly explained where he was and what he was doing. And he was active. He was active in all of this. He wasn't just a bystander. He was coordinating all of this.
So this was a conspiracy.
It was a conspiracy of a few physical beings and a huge number of what you might call heavenly hosts, which are beings that you didn't see, that Jesus was he was an extremely advanced being, and he was able to talk telepathically to them. So he was actually talking like verbally and moving his arms, but there was nobody around him. He was communicating. Think of you right now. How would you communicate with someone far away? You'd communicate with a cell phone. So it was like he was using a cell phone, but he wasn't. He was using his own mind. So he was communicating and orchestrating. I mean, he was making sure everything worked out. He wanted this thing to actually work. I mean, if somebody was actually going to go through an actual crucifixion and go through this thing, he didn't want it to be for a waste. He wanted the person to actually be doing something good. Now, it so turns out, and I explain this in the DVD, that Jesus actually physically could not do the crucifixion, because the only way he could do the crucifixion, you have to understand quantum mechanics, he would have had to have vibrated in a way that would have been compatible with the level of vibration of the people who were polarized, confronting good and evil, things as bad and right, and everything that you experience must be in a state of superposition with you. And the only way Jesus could be involved in a polarized event is to be polarized himself. And he literally couldn't do that without lowering his vibration to ours to be compatible with us. And then he would have been lost in these raging waters just like we are. Think of someone who dives into the ocean to save somebody else and then finds that he gets swept away in the currents himself. That's what would have happened to him. So, and I explain this in the DVD and connect it with quantum mechanics. So Jesus was making it work, but he wasn't the actual guy on the cross. And so then we also got Judas Iscariot at the time of his physical death. Now the Bible is ambiguous. The Bible says at one point that he collapsed in a field and his bowels gushed out.
Yeah.
Another point, the Bible says he hung himself, a different story.
Yeah.
Well, none of that happened. He was actually captured and imprisoned by the military authorities, and he died at their hands in a prison. It was fascinating. We had the whole story of exactly what he was going in his mind and everything. All the details of what he was thinking about and everything, all collected under totally blind conditions. It's absolutely riveting. And then we have what Jesus was doing during the actual crucifixion, what he was actually engaged in. He was busy. He was all by himself, but he was talking to the heavenly host or whatever. He was coordinating everything. He made the event actually work. And finally, we did a remote viewing of the actual person who was crucified. And Seth was totally right. And Daz nailed it. The guy was mentally ill and deluded. It was an adventure gone bad. It was a perfect description, and so it's something that you just have to see. But I do want to say one thing: if you have an open mind, as you see by the time you get to the end of the DVD, my personal opinion is that this does not destroy Jesus and what Jesus' message is, and the impact and the importance of him. It fulfills it. And it makes it a much bigger deal, a much better thing, a much greater thing. Jesus is much more interesting, much more intelligent, and much more lovable, understanding, much more interesting than anything that's taught by the churches. The churches basically say he was a stoic God that died for your sins, all of which is wrong. He didn't die for your sins. There's nobody that can die for your sins. Yeah. No one can wipe the slate clean or anything, because essentially, well, it's complicated, but there were no sins to die for.
Yeah.
First of all, nobody really dies.
Right.
And secondly, all events happen, multiple versions of all of them. So, for example, you can say, well, look at World War II. That was terrible. Well, that means that there's a version of the 20th century that happened in which none of the major wars actually happened. And there's another version, equally as real as the one we remember, in which the World War II ended with nuclear catastrophe, much worse than what we happened. And so, how do you judge sin when all of those people experienced all of those different things, sometimes not doing anything, sometimes doing everything? And so the idea is, if we are all literally made up of the substance of God, then how can God be bad? Meaning God essentially set up this existence that we have, this universe that we have, so that God could experience all of this stuff. And
I'll even go a step further. In my evolution of theology, is that we're co-conspirators. We chose to be here too.
Yeah,
and that's pretty heavy. I mean, that'll not only blow the minds of the religious people, but the people that think they're not religious.
Yeah. Well, anyway, before you judge it, I would ask you to watch it and get the interpretation. And if nothing else, understand the reality of remote viewing. Watch the DVD, the Farsight experiments. Get on the ground running. Understand the nature and the reality that the remote viewing phenomena really is there. And then look at the results for the crucifixion ruse and watch that DVD and then say, well, look, put all concepts of what you thought about reality aside and just look at what is. And then you'll see that the world is more wondrous than anyone ever thought. Remember that all throughout history, people of authority are people of authority because they attempt to control what other people think.
Yeah.
Other people do. That is literally what the definition of an authority is. Someone who says something and other people follow that person. So authorities are designed with the idea of limiting the choices that most people have. Now, this can sometimes be a good thing, and sometimes it can be not a good thing. But when we talk about religion, we're talking about the idea of dogma and faith, which is another way of saying limiting the choice of thoughts that you could have. Now, look at it this way. Would God really want to be limited in what He thought? So it's better to sort of go into everything with an open mind and say, well, the authorities are going to be limiting what options they want me to think, So let me just go into an open mind and sort of look at it for myself and decide. Because if you are in fact a fragment of God, literally of God, made of the substance of God, then God would want to have as free an experience in life as could be, and to be able to think all thoughts, because that's what makes one most joyous. And then go into the idea of looking at remote viewing with an open mind and just see. So anyway, that's my bottom line with regard to the crucifixion ruse. Just keep an open mind, look at the data, and decide for yourself.
Yeah, it's deep and it's heavy and it's interesting and it's challenging, and I like it. Courtney, it's been a little over 2 hours here. It's been so much fun, and I want to get you back again. Maybe we'll do that music thing that we talked about.
I'd love to get back. That'd be great, Randy.
Give your websites out and anything that you want to leave the audience with tonight.
Well, the big thing is, if you go to the Institute's website, www.farsight.org. Oh, let me say, the reason why the crucifixion ruse is not an official project of the Farsight Institute. We had a board meeting, and the board, which is composed of Glenn Wheaton, Lyn Buchanan, myself, and another academic called Bruce Kaufman, they decided unanimously, I finally went along with them, that it was too controversial a project to get the nonprofit institute caught up in it. So decided to release it as an independent project, only because of the controversy. And they decided this without ever looking at the data. So it was just a topic itself. So that's why it's been released as an independent project. Nonetheless, when people buy the DVD, it does go to fund the stuff we're doing with remote viewing. So you're helping the whole remote viewing project with it. Anyway, the website is for the Farsight Institute, www.farsight, like seeing far, FARSIGHT.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. And the other website for that independent project is called www.crucifixionruse.com. And there's some other websites we have, such as farsightpresentations.com, which is a movie website that we're developing. But this is the two websites that you really should do are the Farsight Institute's website, www.farsight.org, and www.crucifixionruse.com. And again, you're helping save the world, in my particular view, when you not just purchase the DVDs, but also watch them and get your friends to watch them.
Good stuff. Thanks, Courtney. We're going to close it out for this week. Coming up next week, I forgot. I completely forgot who. Oh, yeah. Right, here we go. Judy Carroll will be here next week. She's going to talk about the Zeta messages. And the following week, I have Dr. Louise here, Man-Made, the Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. That's going to close it out for this week. I'm Randy Moggins. This is Offplanet Radio. And you can find us during the week at offplanetradio.com as well. See you next week. The truth is out there. It's inside you. Keep looking for it.